Mr. Jones is out in cinemas now, the period drama slash political thriller directed by Agnieszka Holland, starring James Norton, Vanessa Kirby, and Peter Sarsgaard. It's based on the real life story, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty true to reality, streamlining a few elements of the plot, but not really changing or over dramatizing the key events. So, James Norton plays Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist who, at the beginning of the film in the year 1933, is seen warning the British politicians about the dangers of Germany under Hitler. Having actually met Hitler in person and interviewed him, Jones is convinced that there is a new war slowly brewing and that Hitler needs to be contained. He doesn't believe that the UK can do it alone and proposes alliance with the Soviet Union that is, according to all reports, undergoing a massive revolution in terms of its economy. Thanks to the five-year plan, they open new factories, upgrade their army, and so on and so forth. However, Jones's warnings are ignored, and on the other hand, he himself begins to wonder about the sustainability of the Soviet economic boom. Other countries at the time are in recession, and there is no clear source of funding for all the spending by the Communist Party. So Jones decides to go to the Soviet Union by himself and investigate this. Initially, he spends a few days in Moscow hanging out with mainly Walter Duranty, a New York Times correspondent who is perhaps the most influential foreign journalist in the city, and who leads this very hedonist, exuberant lifestyle. But seeing that there are no answers to be found in the city, Jones ends up disregarding the ban on travel, gets on a train to Ukraine, steps out at a station in the middle of nowhere, and starts walking around the country, experiencing for himself what's really going on, namely the massive famine caused by Moscow taking away all the grain. So, I want to talk about the things that I liked about the film first. I think that the story is engaging and clearly presented, and it's well acted. James Norton is really good, but the standout performance for me is Peter Sarsgaard, who plays Walter Duranty. He is just properly slimy and obnoxious and is a real presence in the film. He steals every scene that he's in. I liked the way that the movie is not afraid to go all out with showing the horrors of the desolate Ukraine, the abandoned frozen villages in the middle of winter, poor and hungry children, the lack of humanity all around the country. There are a few scenes which really make a point to show just how horrific the situation was. The movie also does a very good job of contrasting Moscow and London to a degree with Ukraine. The way that Moscow is shown to be very lively, full of people, and largely filmed in warm, lavish interiors, whereas Ukraine countryside is empty and desolate. That ties into the cinematography. For the Moscow scenes, we have a lot of warm colors, whereas for Ukraine, the image is completely washed of all color, almost completely reduced to black and white, deliberately avoiding to show any warmth at all on film, even from natural sources such as the sun. And that makes the Ukraine section of the film all the more visceral. However, there are a couple of things that I didn't like as much, and the first one is also related to cinematography, but not the color use specifically, the camera movement. Most of the film is shot in close-ups with a handheld shaking camera, and I can see why you do that for certain scenes, but I think it is overdone. For the most part, the frantic movements of the camera were tiring to me and took me away from the story more than they enhanced it. Then there's the third act of the film. So the movie has a very clear three-act structure. Act 1, London and Moscow. Act 2, Ukraine. Act 3, Moscow and the UK again. The first two acts are fine, but the third one is paced in a kind of weird way and has a more disjointed structure. And for a while, you're unsure exactly where the movie is going to take you. It's not bad per se, just after how tight the film is before that, there's a noticeable difference towards the end. It gets less engaging and doesn't move at quite the same brisk pace. And finally, the story is framed by scenes of George Orwell, who is also a minor character in the story proper, writing Animal Farm. Personally, I don't think it was the best choice to have that in the film. I mean, yeah, it kind of helps flesh out the conclusions, but first, it breaks up the pacing even more, and second, I think that it is a bit on the nose and feels like hammering a point home, a point which the movie itself makes pretty clearly. Final takeaway for me was one key scene where Jones is arguing with Lloyd George, one of the British politicians, Welsh actually, about reacting to the famine in Soviet Union. And George asks him, well, what do you want me to do? Go to war over this? Break up trading relations? And I think that conversation kind of echoes the modern day China dilemma, where reporters and journalists keep ringing alarm bells about the humanitarian crisis and the ethnic genocide that is taking place at this very moment at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But the world as a whole doesn't really do anything because nobody wants war and nobody can afford to stop trading with China, as we're too reliant on them economically speaking. And in Mr. Jones, it's kind of the same conundrum. What's more important, the economic stability at the cost of moral hypocrisy, or somehow fighting to maintain our values and to live them, not just preach them? So overall, an imperfect but decent film that definitely leaves you thinking afterwards.